right. So, as you know, the diversification of animals is mainly the result of lineages experiencing different selective pressures by which they adapt to to exploiting different resources. So, for instance, the honey creepers in Hawaii are a group of birds that diversified from an ancestor generalist into a myriad of different phenotypes in which different species have evolved very particular big shapes that are especially well suited for exploiting novel resources. But the adaptive diversification process is not only a consequence of extrinsic factors like the existence of ecological opportunities, but also it depends on intrinsic factors. And when I say this, I'm mostly referring to behavior. So the scenario that I'm talking about is that when there's a change in environment, animals usually need to change their behavior somehow in order to exploit new ecological niches. And it's by exploiting these new ecological niches that they are actually able to evolutionarily adapt to them. And as a fun example of a behavioral shift, there's the case of the blue and grey teats in the UK that during the 20th century, well, there was this thing that they were delivering milk bottles to people's doorsteps. So these animals started exploiting this as a new resource, basically by pecking on the lids and drinking the cream that was on top of the bottles. So one could imagine that by getting, well, after many generations underneath these new selective pressures, these animals might eventually end up evolving some weird big shape that might be especially good for exploiting the new resource. Of course, this never happened. One of the reasons it never happened is because in the 70s and in the 80s, supermarkets became popular, so they stopped delivering milk bottles to the doorsteps. But of course, I'm not the first one to talk about the role of behavior in evolution. In fact, Ernst Mayr, more than 50 years ago, said that a shift into a new niche is almost without exception initiated by a change in behavior. And he also said that commonly the other adaptations to the niche, such as the structural ones, meaning the morphology and physiology, are commonly a consequence of that. So in my research is mostly about how animals deal with new selective pressures in a global change context. So what I do is I use tools from global change biology, from behavioral ecology, and from evolutionary biology to try and understand or to try to unravel this question of what's the biological role of animal behavior. And to do that, throughout my career, I've used two different approaches. On the one hand, comparative phylogenetic approaches to study how behavior has influenced adaptive diversification in lineages. This has been mostly aimed at trying to assess what's called the behavioral drive hypothesis, which suggests that changes in behavior expose animals to new selective pressures, and so then they have to adapt to them. So that would be that behavior actually accelerates the rates of evolution, but empirical evidence of this is still scarce today. But today I'm not going to talk to you about this. I will focus more on my more recent research, which is on experimental evolutionary ecology in nature, but also in the lab. And the main questions that I am trying to address here are not anymore about how behavior affects the evolution of other traits like morphology or physiology, but how natural selection can directly act on behavior. And then once, after talking to you about this, I will focus more on the ecological consequences of this selection on behavior. So most biologists are familiar with a scenario like the one depicted here, where on the y-axis you have fitness, and on the x-axis these small curves basically represent different phenotypes. So within a population there's variation, right? Imagine, I don't know, height in humans, right? There's people who are shorter, people who are taller. It's very common to imagine this in morphology. It's also easy to imagine a scenario where conditions change and only some of the phenotypes are particularly well suited for exploiting the new resources. Then what can happen is what we call a natural selection event, in which the average phenotype of the population has shifted. It's It's less commonly acknowledged, but there's a lot of recent interest now on this topic that the same could happen in behavior. So imagine that within a population there might be, for instance, animals that take more risks and animals who take less risks. And they could do well equally in some environments, but differently in other environments. So behavior might also be under natural selection. However, we don't have actual empirical evidence, experimental evidence of this process. And one of the reasons for that is because it's very challenging to assess natural selection in behavior. And that's, on the one hand, because we really need to know the biology of a species and to know the ecological relevance of the behaviors that we study. Then it's also important to be able to measure variation in behavior. So all this individual variation that I was talking about, we need to be able to actually quantify this. And this is not as straightforward as it seems. And then behavior, we need to show that animals consistently differ in behavior. So it's not about what an animal does in one instance, but it's about showing that a particular individual takes more risks always in different scenarios and across time. Then, according to John Endler, who was the father of studies in nature of natural selection, he said that ideally to study natural selection, we should be able to manipulate well-known selective pressures, and then, of course, to track individuals through time so that we can assess their survival and their reproduction. It takes forever. Okay, so as Danny was saying, since I realized that I was never going to be able to do such a study in birds, I moved into lizards. And I started working with Anolis lizards. Anolis lizards, the ones here on the top on the left, I'm studying the brown anole, Anolis segre. They are a model for studies in evolutionary ecology. We know a lot about their behavior, their evolution, and their ecology. But today I will be particularly talking about a predator-prey system, which is composed of the brown anole as a prey and the curly-tailed lizard as a ground predator. So basically brown anoles used to hang out on lower branches but on vegetation, but they need to go to the ground to eat, and then curly-tails are there waiting for them in order to catch them. So in this line, I will be talking a lot today about a risk-taking trade-off. And what does this mean? What it means is that as represented in this cartoon, usually Anolis lizards hang out on lower vegetation, like one would be here just perching, and they are commonly looking at the ground. And they are looking at the ground because they need to obtain food from there. So usually they are predators as well, but they eat insects. So they jump on the ground to catch insects, but on the ground they are more vulnerable to predation themselves. So they need to go back and jump on the vegetation. And I know that an image is going to be more convincing, so this is a video that my friends at Days Edge Productions gave me. Okay, so let's watch it again. So you'll see a cockroach and you'll see a lizard. So you can see it jumps on the ground, grabs the cockroach, and then it darts to the tree again, right? So this animal is acting like there's something dangerous, probably people recording the video in this case, but the first study that I did with Anolis lizards was in Florida, where both species are actually invasive. So it's outside of their native range, which is in Cuba. So the native range of these species are in Cuba and Bahamas, but brown anoles have been in Florida for over 100 years already. However, the curly-tailed lizards have been very recently introduced, like 10 years ago, and their distribution is really patchy. And so what I wanted to study is to try and assess how these so-called animal personalities, so consistent individual differences in behavior, are influenced by two components of global change, which are urbanization and biological invasions. How did we assess inter-individual variation in behavior? That was a big challenge at the beginning, because we didn't have experience in doing that. Basically, if you think about the risk-taking trade-off that I was talking about, we tried to design something that mimicked this. So basically, we used experimental cages in which on one end we have a refuge. We put the animal in the refuge, it stays there for a while as a habituation period. And then it's a very simple design. There's a perch in the middle of the cage. And eventually, eventually from the distance we open the door of the refuge, and then animals at some point poke their heads out and start exploring. That's what we call exploration time. And really animals, like, this is a new environment for them, so they poke their heads out and start getting information of the environment. And then we also assess how much time they spend on the ground until they climb on a perch, which they always do. So basically, this is about being exposed to predation. And the first thing that we checked is that individuals whether individuals actually differed in their behavior, and we found that yes, when we tested the same animal through time and in different conditions, the ones that tended to take more risks were consistently took more risks, whereas the ones that took less risks, well, they kept doing this. So once we saw that, we moved into trying to assess if there were divergent behavioral patterns in different environments. And again, when I talk about different environments, I'll be referring about urbanization and biological invasions. So we assessed populations of anoles in urban areas. So these animals are really successful in colonizing urban areas. So when we talk urban areas in Florida, are not like in here, so extremely dense, right? There's more vegetation, more green areas. So anyways, we tried and assessed the behavioral patterns in urban areas, then in urban areas where those predators had been recently introduced less than 10 years ago at that time, and then also in surrounding forest areas. And just to briefly summarize this, we did find, this is a PC built from putting together a series of different behavioral measurements conducted in the lab. But what we saw is that you could actually separate the populations according to the risk-taking behavior of these populations. So this is telling us that probably, and this is not only on one population, this is in replicated populations. So this seems to be telling us that urbanization and biological invasions are doing something bringing the behaviors of these animals to differ. So then I moved back into the field, and I tried to think about some experiment that actually, in a foraging context, that actually allowed us to know what was happening. So in urban areas, with and without predators, we conducted my favorite experiment of all time, because it's like the simplest that I've ever done. So basically, we located a lizard that was perching on a perch, a tree light or a branch or something, and then we would put a food resource 2 meters away from it. Believe it or not, they don't run away. So then we measured how long it took them to jump and grab the food resource, and then how much time they spend on the ground. So it's that simple. And indeed, in urban areas, so here on the y-axis, you have exposed time on the ground. And what we saw is in urban areas without ground predators, where they have been living for decades with, probably some predation pressure, but not a lot. They spend maybe 90 seconds on the ground. They just grab and process the mealworm and eat them on the ground. Whereas this is very different on the areas where the predators have arrived. And it's not only different. Okay, so the one in the middle represents. Sorry that I don't have a pointer. The one in the middle represents events where there was actually a curly tail that you could see in I think it was, I don't know, in a 10-meter diameter or something like that. But then also in these same populations, when predators were not around, animals behaved in the same way. So it was not something that showed plasticity. So after this study, I think that we showed that we were able to identify ecologically relevant behaviors, both in the lab and in the field. Then we were able to measure individual variation in behavior, and we saw that individuals indeed differ. Then we showed that there were differences in populations that are under different ecological conditions. But now we need the hardest part, which is to actually manipulate and create a field experiment in which we can manipulate selective pressures and then track individuals through time and so on. So to do that, well, in such an experiment, my prediction would be that starting with a population where we have individuals that take more risks and individuals that takes less, who take less risks, in a scenario with no ground predators, we might see that there's selection for increased risk taking. So we would expect that the benefits of taking risks are, animals who take risks are going to be able to get food, and at no cost because there's no predation or there's very low predation. Whereas the opposite would be expected in the presence of predators, because taking a lot of risks would be super costly because they can be killed. So to assess this hypothesis, I designed a new study in which now this time I moved to the native range of the anoles in the Bahamas. And what we did is, well, first we captured almost 300 lizards, and then we moved them back to our field laboratory, which was in Marsh Harbor in Abaco Island in Bahamas, and then we assessed their behavior. The way we did that is very similar to what I was telling you about, only that this time, apart from doing these experiments of time to explore and so on, we did the same thing, but also at the beginning we would expose them to the predator. So we would have live curly-tailed lizards that we actually captured around, and they were inside transparent cages. So basically we would expose the anoles 5 minutes that they could see the prey. So that was a dangerous environment. And then we would close the door, new habituation period, and then open again and measure time to start exploring again and time exposed on the ground. So these are the two behaviors that I'll be talking about. When we measure this, doing this predator exposure thing and without the predator exposure, the still behaviors are consistent. So the ones that take more risks, and the ones that take less risks, take less risks. I'm just not showing this because of time. Okay, so then I was also interested in measuring morphology, because if we want to assess selection in behavior, we want to see if there's parallel selection in morphology. So we've been carrying a portable X-ray machine to the field. So after measuring all the behavioral traits, we would anesthetize the animals and X-ray them in order to get really, really good definition measurements. You need to think that female anoles weight just over a gram. So if we measure these things by hand, the error is too much. And then after measuring morphology, we tagged each individual. So that means basically putting a barcode that's a subdermically inserted alpha tags. So in order to be able to actually identify these animals after we had translocated them. So then that means moving to the translocation phase, which means that I basically found 8 islands that didn't have lizards but could have had lizards. That's based on previous experience from my collaborators of what's the size of an island that can have lizards. But so what happens in this system is that it's very dynamic, and hurricanes are something that happens with some regularity in here. So what happens is that basically lizards colonize the islands, but then hurricanes wipe out the populations. Then vegetation survives, and arthropod communities recovered in 1 or 2 years are almost fully recovered. So that means that we have this scenario where we can play God and translocate locally anoles and do this experiment. So we found 8 such islands by kayaking. Then on 4 of these islands we translocated anoles, and they stayed like that. But on 4 other islands, after a week, we actually translocated the curly-tailed predator as well. So we have 4 islands that act as controls and 4 islands that are predation islands. And then what we did was to go back in 4 months and actually resample the islands many times in order to recapture all the animals that are on the islands. And I know that sounds challenging, but it's totally feasible. Islands are really small. My small islands might be the size of this room. Oh, something happened in the access. So, okay, so moving on to the results, the first thing that we saw, maybe not surprisingly, is that survival in the presence or in the absence of predators was different. So this should say proportion of individuals that survived. With predators, survival was around 33%, so only 1/3 of the lizards had survived after 4 months, whereas survival was 55% in predator-free islands. Then I was also interested in seeing if there were rapid ecological differences under different predation regimes. So we measured perch height. So how high these animals perch, because you would expect that they are farther away or they are not using the ground when there's predator, and that's what we found. So that's basically driven by the fact that so that's perch height in centimeters. On the left, there's no predators there. They are using the ground a lot because they like using the ground. There's food on the ground. So if they can, they spend time on the ground. They don't when there's predators around. And then moving on to the actual results that I was more interested in is whether interindividual variation risk taking actually affected survival. So first I will talk about exploration, so the behavior where they start exploring a new environment, and then I'll move on to the time on the ground. So first, in absence of predators, we found that actually the animals who explored more survived more. So this is time to start exploring. This means that so this is survival probability, so higher survival probability, lower survival probability. And when we talk about time to start exploring, it means that the most explorative animals are here, the ones that take less time to explore, right? So what we see here is that more exploratory animals survive better in the absence of predators. In the presence of predators, however, we found nothing. Then what happened with time exposed on the ground, which is maybe the one that I was more willing to see the results. When we see what happened on islands without predators, there's absolutely nothing. So animals taking more risks have the same survival probabilities than animals taking less risks. So those spending more time on the ground do as well as those two who are never on the ground. But we found a strong pattern of selection in the presence of predators. So that what we see here is that animals taking more risks are penalized and do not have the same, have very low chances of survival, whereas animals who take less risk have much higher chances of surviving. So what we have seen here, if you remember about the predictions, is a selection event. In only 4 months, we've seen that the average phenotype of the population has shifted. And now animals on these populations take less risks. So then I moved on into the question of whether males and females, we saw the same patterns in males and females, and the reason I was interested in that is because Anolisseira is a very sexually dimorphic species, as you can see here. So it's not only about the fact that males are bigger, it's also that their behavior is more conspicuous, they display, whereas females are more secretive, and also they need, in the breeding season, they need to be visiting the ground more often because they are laying eggs continuously, so they need protein all the time. And what we actually saw is that there's nothing in males. We see no selection in males at all. Everything is for females. So females who take a lot of risks, they don't make it on these islands. Whereas females that take very little risks actually have quite high probabilities of surviving. So those phenotypes that are, in case of females, those phenotypes that are really more cautious are doing quite well in the presence of predators. Then I moved on, and from now on I'm only going to be presenting results for females because males are boring. Now I wanted to assess if there's simultaneous selection on behavior and morphology. So if you remember earlier in my talk when I was talking about comparative analysis, I was referring to the fact that commonly, and I have also done this research, we have been more focused on, when we talk about the role of behavior in evolution, it's more about when there's a behavioral change, what happens to morphology, right? Like what are the evolutionary consequences in morphology? But here we have seen that there's selection, very rapid selection on behavior. So then the question is, do they happen at the same time? Is it possible that they are actually happening at the same time and they are not, one is not consequence of the other, or not necessarily? So again, I'll be talking about exploration, time exposed on the ground, and morphology. So this is something that we have seen already. In the absence of predators, more exploratory animals are doing better. So when we repeated the selection analysis, but including behavior as well, that there is actually a significant selection for behavior happening at the same time. So this is parallel and this is independent. So natural selection is acting on behavior and on morphology at the same time. And specifically what's happening here is that females with longer limbs are doing better. And there's studies in anolis lizards, that ecomorphological studies and measuring performance that show that like animals, anolis with longer limbs, they run faster. So that might be something related to that. And then in the presence of predators, we saw that animals that take less risks are doing better. So then what happens in morphology? And in this case, we also found selection for a morphological trait, only that this time it was body size. Again, this is only for females. What happens here is that smaller females are surviving better. I have to say that all the animals that we translocated were adults, so they had the size of adults, so this is not a young versus adult thing. It's just, for some reason that we don't know, smaller females are also surviving better. Some of my colleagues say that they might be better able to hide on holes, because that's what they do when they are scared, they hide in holes. I'm not sure there's such a huge difference, but so, and then just to finish this study, since we found this parallel selection of morphology and behavior, now the next question is, okay, which one is more important? What's the effect size of each of these factors? So we quantified, here I'm plotting the relative effect size on the y-axis, meaning how much of the variation on survival, or what proportion of variation of survival in percent is explained by behavior and what proportion is explained by morphology. So in the absence of predators, we see that morphology is actually explaining a larger part of variation. So still behavior explains almost 10% of mortality, which is significant, or well, it's important, but morphology is more important. But then in the presence of predators, it's the other way around, which is really, really, well, amazing to me. So what we see is that more than 20% of variation in survival is driven by behavior. So we're talking about, I think to me this implies that, we have not been looking at behavior sometimes at all, and always focusing on morphology, and this is telling us that, wait, behavior can be super important, at least in the short term. And also, what's remarkable to me is that you can see how the relative importance is context dependent. So morphology is more important in one context, and behavior is more important in the other context. So, now after talking about selection in behavior and morphology, I would like to touch base on some other research that I'm doing in the same study system, where I'm studying how behavioral shifts can actually affect resource flow dynamics and may alter the functioning of ecological or of biological communities. So this cartoon here is just to give you a general idea of how those islands look like. This is just a small section of an island. But what you have here, what we have on these islands is the brown anoles. They look red to me right now, but the brown anoles, these guys feed on two different guilds of insects. On herbivores, on lower vegetation, so we see that they are doing this, but also more on detritivores like isopods and amphipods that are commonly on the ground. Then on the ground, of course, there's the curly-tailed lizards, and there's also spiders that also feed on the insects on the vegetation. So what's important here is about the detritivores there, the isopods and the amphipods. So there's this spatial distribution on these islands where there's terrestrial plants in the middle of the islands, but then on the edges of the islands, many times there's seaweed, because this is a marine system. Then storms bring seaweed, and sometimes in important amounts. So that represents a really important source of organic matter that decomposes there for a while. So what happens is that the communities of isopods and amphipods really bloom some months of the year. So on the edges of the islands, there's a super, super rich resource to be exploited. So my expectation being there in the field was, okay, this is great. When there's no predators, they are on the edges, they are doing this, but like when there are predators, again, the good old trade-off, right? if they go all the way to the edges of the island, they are exposed. They are really exposed to predation. So if we can find a way of measuring what they are eating, if they are eating more of the seaweed-derived insects or the terrestrial plant-derived insects, that would be interesting to actually inform us about how behavioral shifts cascade into changes in the biological functioning of the communities. So what happens is that the seaweed that is on the edge of the island, so in here, that represents an island. We don't have palm trees like this, but that's okay. So there's terrestrial vegetation more on the center, but then on the edges there's this marine subsidies, these seaweeds. And seaweeds, as compared to seafloor plants, have enriched amounts of delta-13 carbon. So these enriched amounts of delta-13 carbon as a proportion to delta-12, which is the common one, means that if animals are eating the marine resources, this enrichment is transferred into the tissues of the animals that are feeding on the marine subsidies. So what one would expect is that individual anoles that eat a lot of detritivores actually will have higher proportion of delta-13 carbon, whereas individuals feeding more on herbivorous insects will have lower proportion of delta-13 carbon. And of course my prediction was this will, one thing would happen in the absence of the predators and the other one in the presence of the predators. So what I'll represent here are the results of this quantification. So what I did here is, these results are for 1 year after the translocation. So I did the initial translocation in the summer of 2016, and in the summer of 2017, we went there, we caught every lizard, and we took a small piece of the tail of the lizard. So if you are if you're familiar with the wall lizards here, the sargantanas, you can actually take the tail and it regrows, right? So anoles do the same thing. So it's not a big cost for them to actually get a really small piece of their tails, but then we can quantify the stable isotopes there and infer what they have been eating. So, okay, for some reason this is not showing well, but what you have here, that's just frequency. So that's the average, what the average population is feeding on. And this is a measure of amount of marine derived resources, right? This is using a formula. If you're interested, I'll show you later. But basically, the more on the right in this axis means that a population, so control is in gray, and that should be in red. But in gray, you can see that on control islands, animals are really feeding on more marine resources. So that the amount, like the proportion of marine resources that are going to the terrestrial or high up into the food web is higher on control islands than on predation islands, which is this pattern. And this plot is showing founder individuals. Founder individuals means that these are only measuring the animals that we put in 2016 and were still alive in 2017. But because anoles reproduce every year, in 2017 we also had offspring. So we could try and answer the question, okay, are these changes, like, is this only that, you know, animals that are surviving are eating different things, or also that holds after one generation, so that's a consistent ecological shift. And we see that this is what happens. I'm sorry that you cannot see this really well, I'm not sure why. This is I think this is a Mac PC formatting issue, I guess. So I'm not sure if you can see, this is the line of the predator. So basically this is just to show that patterns are similar. So there's well, I don't know if you call it long-term or mid-term effect, where what's happening here is that there's been a predator-driven behavioral shift, and that this behavioral shift is actually like changing or bringing cascading changes in the system in a way that the amount of marine resources that are going up the food chain are different on islands with predators and without predators. So that's it for me today. I hope that I have more or less convinced you that animal behavior is worth studying, especially in a context of global change. When I have my own lab, I'm hoping to be able to continue studying these questions, especially in the context of urbanization and biological invasions. And basically my aim is to continue doing this basic research, but to try and ultimately contribute to the conservation of biodiversity and of the ecosystem services that they provide. So with that, I would like to acknowledge friends and collaborators, people at the Lossos Lab at Harvard, my student Nina Morales, who did an excellent job studying the food webs in the Bahamas, and then my advisors, mentor students, and current collaborators, and my funding agencies. And thanks so much. I'm ready to take questions. Please.
Hi. Going back to your main experiment with the islands, do you know much about how heritable the risk-taking behavior is?
Yep.
Through the generations, and then on the other hand, how plastic the behavior is?
Yes.
So if you took away the predators, would the same individuals change?
So that's a crucial question, right? Because so far we have seen selection. We don't know if evolution is happening, and that's because we don't know the heritability of behavior, of course. So what we are doing is we have genetic samples for all the individuals in this study. So we've been taking tail tips of everyone. So now we're doing a pedigree. We're building a pedigree with 4 generations of data that hopefully will allow us to know about heritability. But indeed, that's basically my most important question that I'm trying to answer now. Thanks.
Actually, well, first, thanks very much. That's really quite amazing.
Thanks.
I had exactly the same question, but then, so you still don't know for your study. But do you know from other studies? So
yeah.
Is there information to say in general whether behavioral traits are more or less heritable than morphological traits?
Yeah, great question. So yes, there is some information, considerable information. So commonly, when it has been studied, it has been shown that behavior is indeed heritable. Of course, behavior is flexible. There's a flexibility component in behavior always. I mean, I'm not trying to sell otherwise because that would be foolish. But there's indeed an heritability component, and the heritability component, for what we know, for the studies that have been done, is somewhere in between morphological traits and life history traits. So it's not as heritable as morphological traits, but it's heritable enough, and it's slightly more heritable than life history traits. But again, there's not a ton of data, but that's what we know for now.
Did you find any correlations between your behavioral and morphological traits?
Yeah, great question. No, but we definitely checked that because it's one of the first predictions, right? It's like you would expect that morphology and behavior were somehow correlated. Even traditionally, like with males, big males are going to do that, and small males, we find nothing. And we found nothing in Florida and in the Bahamas. But thanks for asking that, because I should have said that already.
Related with this thing,
yeah.
Apparently you show that in terms of selection, not in terms of evolution, that there should be a link between behavior and morphology. Because you find that shyer individuals and smaller individuals are selected in the context of hybridization, and this should link with. But the thing is, this only will happen if there is a heritable component in behavior. That probably is
also, yeah.
The question was the measurements of behavior, how the test of to know whether the animal was shy or born, how long it take, how long it took between the two measurements.
So I've done many different things. So for the main study that I was talking about, the islands, these were just 2 days difference. But before that, in Florida, I have done a week difference, and I have done this in the wild and in captivity, and then in captivity in different scenarios. But I have something else, which is 2016. We did that. We translocated the individuals, but then in 2017, as I was saying, like every year we've been catching everyone. So what I did is I got a subsample of animals in 2017 for which I had measured the behavior in 2016, and I repeated the behavioral measurements. So 1 year after. after having been living in a completely different place. And I actually have this somewhere. There you go. So this is 2016 and 17. This is risk-taking behavior. There's an outlier there. I'm not going to take it out because I don't know what, but it's surprisingly repeatable, at least for the sample size that we have. So that's quite amazing to me. And about the correlation, we found no correlation. So the way I see it, there's parallel selection in both traits. Whether this is going to be, whether one thing is going to pull the other or not also depends on, linkage disequilibrium, like whether the traits can be inherited like together, or they, they are not. So I don't know what's going to happen. But for now, we don't find any association among the traits, between the traits. Yes?
So just a question about your talk and the last sentence. This means that, for instance, in Ibiza, this will be a source of diversification because you have different pressure, selective pressure, you have a predator or not. So feel rapidly, it's a rapid response.
You mean without, species, so you mean without, within Ibiza, you mean, or?
Well, yes,
okay.
In general, but
so,
example.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, unfortunately, the invasion is spreading. Yeah. So, the prediction is that all the island is going to be invaded soon. Not the, how's that called? Not the inlets, like the small, what's that called? The small islands around the, around Ibiza. These have not been colonized yet, although 2 snakes have been caught in the sea. So so I think that probably there will not be a difference because all parts of the island are going to be.
It depends if the behavior changes so fast that it depends. You have some lizards have one behavior and others have one, so maybe
it could be, but then it would imply.
Like we're thinking about invasions are bad. So maybe it's a source of diversification.
Well,
yeah,
I see what you mean. So on the one hand, it depends on how one considers biodiversity, right? One is, if we talk about genetic diversity as being something good, even if there was that disruptive selection happening, still we would be losing some genetic diversity.
No, it depends how fast it's going.
Well, you mean if there was evolutionary innovation and so on? Yes, but it's very difficult that this would happen in the short term, right?
Yeah,
but
well, this is in the books.
Yeah.
Your experiment is quite fascinating because it's a rapid change. Could be a rapid change on the genetics of the
Yep. So we'll see what happens. I mean, of course we will get samples for everything. Genetic samples, and we will continue to do. We're doing rat sequencing analysis. So we'll see what happens with that. Hopefully we'll be able to measure evolution, at least in the Bahamas.
Exactly. How fast is the evolution?
Yeah.
So what about the males?
Boring. They are boring.
I think that when we look at cognition, males also are they don't follow any rule. What happens?
Really?
Well, yeah, in some other studies it's the same. The males don't go that way.
They don't get it.
Probably. That's most likely.
But you look at the fitness curve, and it looked like there was a stabilization.
Yeah, I was expecting that question. That's a good question. So it's just the plot. I tested for stabilizing selection, and there's no stabilizing selection.
But it requires a huge sample.
Yes. So that's the other thing. That So on the one hand, I have to say that there was no stabilizing selection because we don't find it, and whereas our sample size is enough to find directional selection for females, the same sample size for males doesn't allow us to say that with confidence that there's, or with any confidence that there's stabilizing selection. Could there be stabilizing selection, and then through generations maybe we'll find it? It could be. So I'm not saying this is impossible.
You should go by Asian, but you don't have to value.
Okay, I'll take the advice. But so that's one thing, and there was also something else that you were referring to. about the males and the females. Well, yeah, we'll talk later. Yes?
One question that overlaps a bit with what you were mentioning earlier, but you're not talking about the role of behavioral plasticity at all. Clearly, you're looking at how consistent it is within individuals and
Yep.
exist in the same context.
Yes.
But could you imagine that this is all driven by just some individuals that are just able to switch?
Yes, so that's a great question, and this is, I didn't explain this that much because, you know, I didn't choose that, I didn't have time, but that's exactly the reason why I did at least 2 measurements even in the study with islands, and that's because I actually measured the slope of the response. So if you remember about the experimental setup, I was mentioning that I would do the same experiments with the curly tail and without the curly tail, right? So one would expect that, so it was without the curly tail first and then with the curly tail. So if plasticity is relevant, then you would see the slope of the response of the measure of risk-taking from one to the other would determine survival. So I included this in the analysis, and flexibility was not relevant. But this is a very good question, and it's super important. And I was not necessarily expecting this to be the case. Like, it could have been, and maybe we're not measuring some component of flexibility right, and there's something else that is important. So that could totally be the case. But for what we have measured, we didn't find anything. Yeah. More questions? All right. Well, thanks so much.